Memes. Two of my most favorite YouTubers, Alternate History Hub and Genetically Modified Skeptic, have churned out a couple of these types of videos recently, and I must say it's made me a bit jealous because, unfortunately,
Interesting, okay. Well, I've got to say that the feeling is actually mutual. Not only is JJ one of my favorite YouTubers, but also I'm a bit jealous of his 35 Tribes video where he talks about 35 different political ideas or tribes in Canadian politics. Not that I would ever cover that subject myself, but the format for that video was just phenomenal. I wish I had thought of it. So, since I'm sure you agree, JJ, that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery and that mild plagiarism is the name of the game here on YouTube, I thought I'd make a somewhat similar video to that 35 Tribes masterpiece of yours. My subject, however, will be 8 different identities of atheists in American culture. Only 8, partly because I'd like to spend substantial time on each category, and partly because I can't produce charming cartoons for each identity myself. I don't have the money to commission 35 illustrations, and so 8 is a more affordable number. A quick note in post here, I was working with a few illustrators and just wasn't getting quite what I wanted for this project, so I decided to actually reach out to JJ to see if he'd be interested in doing these illustrations for this video, and he was. So JJ is actually the one who made the illustrations for this. Thank you so much, JJ. I really appreciate your willingness to help me rip you off even more thoroughly. Thank you. I really cannot thank you enough. An idea I'd like to explore and even counter here is that atheism isn't or can't be an identity because it defines a person by what they are not rather than what they are. I understand the thinking there, but my counter to that idea is that if you live in a context where doing, thinking, and being a certain thing is common enough, then not doing, thinking, or being that certain thing inevitably becomes a thing of its own. If the context is right, the negation of an identity can become its own identity. In preparation for this video, I interviewed several atheists of different backgrounds, so as I discuss each of the identities on the list, I'll show clips from these interviews here and there. These identity categories are not all mutually exclusive. I actually represent 3 of those I'll discuss. Also, I'm sure there are even more atheist identities in the US than those I'll cover, so if you know of any I've missed, let me know in the comments. We'll begin with the ex-religious identities on the list. The ex-Jehovah's Witness, or XJW.
Every ex-Jehovah's Witness atheist I know goes hard for at least one holiday. I try to go hard for all of them, personally.
Each character you'll see here was based on a person I interviewed that represented that identity. In this case, it was my friend Rudy B., otherwise known as X-Cult Baby on social media. Jehovah's Witnesses are very strict. They're one of, if not the most strict religious group that I'll discuss in this video. They don't celebrate holidays and will punish those who are found doing so. They engage in just constant meetings, several times a week for most people. They strongly discourage secular friends. You are to consider yourself very much apart from people like that. They're very legalistic. They have a lot of very specific doctrine. They also forbid any kind of political activity. Possibly most infamously, they practice shunning. So if you are what's called disfellowshipped from the congregation for some, let's face it, minor infraction, then your own parents may not speak to you. Your family won't speak to you. No one in the congregation is allowed to speak to you, or else, they could face consequences for that themselves. This means that many or most ex-JWs are shunned by family, and I'm sure you can imagine the consequences of that. Serious social fallout for leaving this group. Naturally, that affects how ex-Jehovah's Witnesses make relationships going forward. They can often have some abandonment or attachment issues, which is pretty understandable. The ex-JW community is very active, both offline and online, and as my friend Rudy says, they don't necessarily always get along. There is drama in the ex-JW community, but there is camaraderie in sharing all the past experiences and traumatic experiences that they do.
There's definitely a lot of camaraderie there. Like in any group of people, of course, there's a lot of differences of thought and opinion. There's people who block each other. There's people who disagree with each other. But being able to just look at somebody and be like, that was weird, right? Wasn't that crazy? They're like, yeah, really f***ed my shit up. Just being able to relate on that level is something that makes it worthwhile to take on that label for me. I've never felt like identifying myself as an atheist was me identifying myself as something that I wasn't. Like I said before, I left a very tight-knit religious community. So finding community in other people that had similar lines of thinking and were exploring some of the same topics as me was important for my and I'm not as active in the atheist community now as I was back then, but I needed that sense of community. And even if everything we were rallying around was something we didn't believe, I needed something to rally around. I needed people to rally with.
Jehovah's Witnesses are often strongly disciplined in reading, writing, studying, speaking, so a lot of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses are too. My friend Owen from the channel Telltale is an excellent speaker, probably one of the most studious and hardworking people I have ever known, and I think that comes across in his content. Meanwhile, Rudy is known among their friends to be very well-spoken, and that's one of the reasons why I decided to interview them. Since receiving a college education is forbidden within the Jehovah's Witnesses, a lot of ex-JWs don't have higher education. They quite often make up for that by being as hardworking and well-spoken, studious, as I've said. I'll say this about several of the identities that I'll discuss here, but ex-JWs will often go through a kind of exploratory phase after they come out of the organization, making up for lost time by indulging in some of the supposedly sinful behaviors that they were not allowed to engage in. I'm not saying that people go crazy and do unhealthy things, although I guess that is possible. I'm just saying that they may explore things that were off limits before.
Pretty much every ex-Jehovah's Witness atheist I know goes hard for at least one holiday. I try to go hard for all of them, personally. But I know some people who are like, my birthday is the most important day of the year, and it's not because I'm selfish, it's because I was deprived of these in my childhood. No one can take this away from me. And we're all just like, yes, absolutely, go off, queen. And there's some who are like, I want to go to the memorial and drink the wine in front of everyone and then storm out with the middle fingers up. I have a friend who, as soon as she got out, she was getting tattoos and piercings like the moment that she was out from under her parents' roof, which I totally get. I was still pretty reluctant for a while because, I was excommunicated before I actually stopped believing. But when I got more to that point, I was, experimenting with drugs and stuff. I was drinking underage for a little while. For some people, it's kind of like a second puberty. I feel like I've had 3 with kind of learning more about myself and transitioning and leaving a repressive religion. I think the biggest thing that I was like, I'm gonna sin, I'm gonna do it, was like just being out about being queer, like fully like I am pansexual and you can't do anything about it. I didn't go out of my way to do it. I'm not going out of my way. It's just that the things I happen to like doing are a lot of them sinful.
I'm going to discuss stereotypes about each identity, not because I want to perpetuate them, but because I think it can give us a glimpse into primarily what outsiders tend to think about these identity groups. Now, with ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, the big one Rudy told me was that they're bitter. This bitterness is related to a feeling of wasting their lives in the organization or just bitterness against the harmful actions of the organization itself.
I don't know that many people who left the Jehovah's Witnesses and are just neutral about it. Almost nobody. It definitely leaves a bitterness, and I would say that that's probably, it's so common that it's pretty much a stereotype at this point.
When I asked Rudy who stereotyped ex-JWs as being this way, they had a very interesting answer that I'd like to include here.
Honestly, it comes from within the ex-JW community, is that we just look at each other and we're like, we are a bitter people. Like, we're also super happy to be out here living our lives, but when we think about that, it gets under our skin still. Like, although I would say there is definitely a stereotype among Jehovah's Witnesses about ex-Jehovah's Witnesses of us being bitter, but they pretty much solely characterize us as being just bitter and not having any real reasons to say what we're saying or do what we're doing.
Okay, that's all for XJWs, so now we'll move on to the X-Fundamentalist, or X-Fundy. I represent this category, so this cartoon is of me. Really, the entire culture of fundamentalism is based around the emotion of fear. You don't act out, you don't dress certain ways, you don't do certain things because you're afraid. Often just as much as JWs, fundamentalists are extremely strict, meaning that ex-fundamentalists come from an extremely strict and repressive environment. There are rules and strongly enforced norms about clothing, music, movies, even like card games, substances too. Within our fundamentalist church, some people considered my family to be quite distastefully liberal because my sister wore pants. Also, I played instruments other than piano, and I listened to secular music. That made it to where many kids in the church were not allowed to hang out with me, and I had somewhat of a bad reputation for being this secular bad influence, I guess, even though I believed everything that they did. I just listened to the Ramones. Oh no. It's very common for corporal punishment of children to be considered necessary, so most ex-fundamentalists have kind of trauma surrounding being disciplined in this rather abusive way, being hit when they were as young as, it gets bad. Sometimes it's like a year old. A lot of the time it starts at like 2 or 3, but ask an ex-fundamentalist what their parents' paddle was named, and they will probably be able to give you a detailed answer. Naturally, a lot of us have very strong feelings against corporal punishment. I have some guests joining me now. I was actually just about to tell them about how ex-fundamentalists were often strongly affected by the satanic panic, so I could not, play Pokemon, I couldn't do Yu-Gi-Oh!, I was not allowed to watch any horror movies, and I had a very deep-seated fear of demons because I was told that, demons lived in things like poker cards because they were involved with gambling, so I thought there was demons around every corner. It's a little different than how you were raised.
Yeah, I feel like I didn't think that playing with cards could get me demon possessed or something.
Yeah.
But if I watched a horror movie that was about demonic possession, it would really freak me out.
Yeah. A lot of us also have what I would call hell trauma, basically having been instilled with just an intense fear of hellfire. Really, the entire culture of fundamentalism is based around the emotion of fear. You don't act out, you don't dress certain ways, you don't do certain things because you're afraid. And really, ultimately, that's grounded in being afraid of burning for all eternity in a literal lake of fire. Even after leaving the faith, a lot of us still struggle with fear of hell. This is why I made my video where I go all the way to Jerusalem to basically debunk and directly confront any notion that hell was a real place. I was just trying to overcome my fear of hell and hope other people do the same. A lot of us were homeschooled. I was homeschooled partially for educational reasons, partially for medical reasons, but it's extremely common for homeschool communities to be just dominated by Christian fundamentalists, I think especially in the South. I think a lot of ex-fundamentalists worry that their social skills are not up to snuff or just have trouble fitting in general because they were not socialized the same way as most people. Public schools were seen as vestiges, incubation chambers of the demonic. I was afraid of being in public schools when I was a kid because I thought they were so problematic somehow.
I was just gonna say, I think it's even tougher for people that are ex-fundy who also grew up as missionary kids like I did, because it's not only are you taught that anything that's secular is demonic and super bad, but also you didn't grow up in American culture, and so you're come back to the US for college, and you think everything that's secular and American is super horrible, but then you also don't even know what people are talking about half the time. I had no idea what people were referencing most of the time. So
One reason so many fundamentalists homeschool their kids is because they are young earth creationists. They don't believe in evolution. In fact, they think that evolution is an evil conspiracy concocted to rebel against God or hide God from people. Oh, and for those of you who don't know what young earth creationist means, it means someone who believes that God created the world about 6,000 years ago, first of all, in 6 literal days, and on the 7th day he rested. This means that learning about actual science and actual history is often very influential on fundamentalists making their way out of their faith and deconstructing. I mean, I know that for me, learning about science specifically and evolution specifically was really a huge influence on me getting out of the faith. For me, my post-deconstruction exploratory period, if you could even say that I've had one, has been primarily based around learning about actual science and history. I mean, I feel like I've been addicted to it ever since I left, really. Within Christian fundamentalism, women are usually forbidden from pursuing higher education or a career. So that means that when women deconstruct their faith, leave the faith, they're often quite socially and financially disadvantaged. It's very difficult to build a life for yourself on your own, separate from the social ties that, you have within the church, when you can't really have a career, when you can't make enough money to pay for rent, and most of your social ties don't really take you seriously, and you may have some self-esteem issues because of that. Again, we often have trouble assimilating into the real world because we're just trained to be so highly sensitive to worldly activities. I mean, for me, I actually just this last weekend had a kind of proud moment because I went to a bar with a bunch of friends and didn't get so anxious that I had to run out. It's really hard for me to be around alcohol or just things that I was so strongly conditioned to be afraid of. The ex-fundy post-deconstruction exploratory phase is definitely a thing. It's a bit of a stereotype that some ex-fundamentalists, because they're not really taught moderation, because they're taught it's either all or nothing with things like drugs and alcohol, they'll go a little bit too far off the deep end when they're exploring those things and develop problems. That's not everyone. That doesn't always happen, but a lot of us ex-fundamentalists have seen it too many times among our friends. I should say there is a lot of healthy exploration too, though. I mean, people exploring their sexuality and realizing that they don't just like opposite sex partners, or they can get piercings, or they can get tattoos, or they can dye their hair. I mean, for some people, I think especially women, they'll post pictures in ex-fundy recovery groups of just putting a purple streak in their hair, and it's this massive step for them. That's how repressed we are. The main stereotype of ex-fundamentalists, I think, comes from other kinds of Christians. They'll say things like, you just didn't like the strictness of your home life, and so you ran away and rejected Christianity because you thought it was as legalistic and gross and oppressive as your home. They might also say you had a brain-dead Christian faith. You didn't really understand Christianity because you were just steeped in all that fundamentalist nonsense, and that's why you left. You were never really a real Christian. The brain-dead Christian faith thing, directly borrowed from the man, William Lane Craig himself, when he was describing ex-fundamentalist apologia.
That the intellectual life of this person was just allowed, it was stagnant. He had a brain-dead Christian faith.
Brain dead? Wow.
He counts, right? Certain kinds of Mennonite count as fundamentalist, I think. I'm going to count it. All right, moving on to ex-Muslim.
Very good question.
This character is based on my new friend, Apostate Aladdin, who has a great YouTube channel you should check out, by the way.
Why can't I just ignore it and go on with my life like everybody else? Is it because I'm sinful? Is it because my heart isn't pure? We don't realize that so many around us, we could even know someone in our lives who's going through the same thing. And the reason why they're going through it is because they think they're the only person out there.
This is another kind of person who often comes from a very restrictive culture, especially if their family actually comes from the Middle East. In the US, most ex-Muslims are ethnic minorities, and so that's obviously very influential. Where a person deconverted and where their family was when they did is also quite influential. Someone who is a first-generation American will have a different experience than someone who grew up in like the Middle East and then moved to the US without any of their family, maybe after quietly deconverting, or if their family has been here for generations, they'll have a pretty different experience than the other people. So where you grew up, where you left the faith, where your family is will have a serious effect on your experience as an ex-Muslim. Of course, comment section, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that a lot of Muslims that have been in the US for many generations are typically much more liberal people, actually more liberal than like your standard evangelical, and definitely more so than your standard fundamentalist. And so the effect of you leaving the faith may be different. It may not be so much centered on the fact that you don't believe the faith and have more to do with the fact that you don't have this thing that bonds you together with the family as much. Whereas I know of ex-Muslims who basically left the faith when they were still living in an Islamic country. They kind of feared for their life, and when they eventually were able to, they moved to, the US or Canada and felt like an ideological refugee there, and are only now able to actually publicly identify themselves as ex-Muslim and not worry about their life being in danger. Generally, I would say that ex-Muslims are in considerably more social and even physical danger when they come out of their faith than, say, like an ex-Christian. I was never worried that I would be physically assaulted or worse for talking about leaving the faith. I was just worried about all of my relationships being destroyed. And an ex-Muslim may be worried about, yes, all their relationships being destroyed, but their life literally also being destroyed. Naturally, a lot of ex-Muslims will spend a very long time in the closet, so to speak, because the consequences for them coming out are just so severe. They really, really have to be ready if they're going to do something like that. Much of the time, they'll perceive themselves as being very much alone in questioning the faith or even wanting to speak up against it. But when they do, they find that there are tons and tons of people that they've known for a long time that, haven't really believed it, have wanted to speak out, but have been too afraid to do so. I mean, the consequences are just that steep.
Many people tend to turn that frustration on themselves. They feel like there's something wrong with them. Why can't I just ignore it and go on with my life like everybody else? Or is it because I'm sinful? Is it because my heart isn't pure? All these things that I'm sure you've heard as well. We don't realize that so many around us, we could even know someone in our lives who's going through the same thing. And the reason why they're going through it is because they think they're the only person out there. So that's the importance of finding each other and realizing that you're not alone in that kind of thought pattern. Some people have a lot of shared trauma, like similar experiences that they went through, and they always thought that it was a fringe case, or they always thought that they had a fault or a contribution to being in that position. And then when you realize the scale of it, it really helps people move forward.
So Islam being so highly politicized in the US means that some of that affects ex-Muslims. The political left in the US is often on the side of religious apostates. Huffington Post, for instance, will run things about leaving Christianity or will kind of mock Christianity here and there. But that's not the case when it comes to ex-Muslims. Often they are untouchable or even seen as somehow bigoted. The political left does not want to play into anti-Muslim bigotry or what they call Islamophobia. And so they often won't platform ex-Muslims, even when the ex-Muslim is saying something that they would otherwise agree with. If it was about Christianity, they would agree with it. So when speaking about the problems of their former communities, ex-Muslims have to walk this line of not fueling the fire of anti-Muslim bigotry, but still shining a necessary light on extremism that does exist within Muslim communities. They want to make change, but don't want to give ammunition to anti-Muslim bigots and anti-immigration xenophobes.
I feel like we have the disadvantage as well of Islam being such a hot topic and a very sensitive topic. We are often spoken over by people who don't want to accidentally hurt Muslims or offend Muslims, or they don't want to seem like they're bigoted against a certain group of people. and we end up losing our voice because of that. Because I can see the kind of backlash that you would receive when you talk about such a topic, when you're perceived as an outsider, as someone with, I don't want to bring race into it, but someone with, white privilege. How can you talk about a minority this way? But the reality of it is, Muslims are not a minority all over the world. It extends deeper than American politics, for example, or even European politics. But unfortunately, some of these negative sentiments that Muslims have about us do carry over. For example, there's this idea that all ex-Muslims, especially the ones who object to Islam to any degree or criticize it or think anything negative of it publicly, they're doing that because they're lashing out because of personal trauma and hurt that they went through, that they're misunderstanding Islam and Muslims. And it is very frustrating coming from such outside sources, because it feels like we're not only not heard, but we're, in a sense, misrepresented and maybe even demonized. And it's working, like it's reaching that far outside of our circles. This is the case with a huge population of Muslims, not just fundamentalists. And people truly don't understand that. And it's important that we try to bring awareness to that, but at the same time, not feed into the crowd of people who are saying this population is coming to your country to take over or something of the sort.
Because the left refuses to platform them much of the time, ex-Muslim activists have been known to go on to right-wing media shows like Dave Rubin or PragerU, because those are the only kind of media that will actually platform them. You can say that maybe those shows just want to add fuel to the fire of, xenophobia and bigotry, and maybe you're right, but much of the time the issues that are being spoken about are still legitimate. So a lot of ex-Muslims who are not right-wing take some issue with this, may feel conflicted about it, or at least uncomfortable.
I was really turned off by anyone who would appear on those platforms. And as someone who needed some sort of community or guidance or understanding that I wasn't alone, I felt more alienated by these examples, because I felt like my instincts, my indoctrination was kicking in and telling me that this is the, figurative devil that I was warned about, that this is what happens when you lose your faith and so on. So for me, it was counterproductive. For many other people, it was a way to have a voice. And I think that, as you've mentioned, a lot of it comes from the fact that many more progressive or more neutral, even mainstream platforms don't want the negative association that comes with this controversy of painting Islam in any negative light, or by association, anyone who follows it, or by having someone who claims that they've been harmed or that there is a lot of harm being caused by Muslim communities or because of Islam directly. I feel like because my point of view was not well represented, I felt a responsibility to be out there and have people know that that's not the only kind of voice an ex-Muslim could have. That's not the only kind of ex-Muslim out there. And though we still haven't gotten that mainstream coverage, or we haven't gotten huge platforms to talk to us as often, we're gaining popularity. And the more voices we have, the more varied our points of view are, the less that some people would need or feel the need to rely on such platforms and such alliances.
The stereotypes here are that they left Islam or are speaking against Islam publicly because they just want attention and money, which is incredibly ridiculous, honestly. I mean, the consequences for doing this are absurd. It's crazy to think that they would do this because they want positive attention. I actually made a video a few years back with 4 ex-Muslims about the lies that Muslims tell about ex-Muslims. Many of them are harmful stereotypes like the ones I've mentioned. All right, let's move on to the ex-evangelical. My wife Taylor grew up evangelical, so the cartoon here is of her. This is, by population, probably the largest and I think most recognizable category on this entire list. Evangelical is not actually a specific denomination of Christianity. It's kind of an umbrella term, which is just as political as it is theological, unlike many of the other categories here. Theologically, evangelicals are a bit more diverse than some of the other groups I've mentioned on this list, but at their core, I think, are two main features. One being a belief in a born-again experience, accepting Jesus Christ into your heart, as Taylor and I both did, and two, being politically conservative. Evangelicals are known to have their own hang-ups about music and movies and public school and stuff like that, but generally, I would say that they're less restrictive than Jehovah's Witnesses or Muslims or fundamentalists. The vast majority of ex-evangelicals grew up in a conservative household, especially if they're white. As I understand, political differences among evangelicals are basically divided entirely along racial lines. Many ex-evangelicals probably experienced some kind of amalgamation of Christian faith and conservative politics in their childhood, maybe coming in the form of something like Awanas, a Christian nationalist Bible memorization club. I participated in that, and boy, did I memorize a lot of stuff. Purity culture and LGBT issues were central to many of our upbringings. That was something that our cool youth pastor often spoke about, and, we had to conform to their ideas on if we didn't want to be socially punished. So, ideas about purity culture, modesty, and LGBT issues are often central for people leaving evangelicalism. Someone may think that double standards for men and women's dress is inappropriate, or they may realize that they have some same-sex attraction that they struggle. Or they may just think that the treatment of non-cis or non-straight people is not a good thing, and deconstruct their faith as a result of that. Speaking against purity culture, speaking against homophobia, often very, very big identifiers of ex-evangelicals. They will be very loud about that. I'm sure you've seen some TikToks along those lines before. Political deconstruction can be just as significant or even precede spiritual deconstruction for a lot of ex-evangelicals. Many ex-evangelicals will have political differences with their parents, and that may even be the main point of strife and disagreement for them. Most evangelicals, at least white evangelicals, are very, very, very staunch supporters of the Republican Party, and most ex-evangelicals are, they're not. Stereotypes about ex-evangelicals primarily come from evangelicals themselves, as they're very influential and vocal within our culture. Those are that ex-evangelicals left the faith because they wanted to sin, specifically because they wanted to be gay or sexually immoral or get abortions, because apparently that's just a fun activity that we do. In furthering these stereotypes, often evangelicals will use terms like, you're following the culture or the liberal media. If I'm remembering right, the Babylon Bee made a kind of satirical video furthering all these stereotypes just totally unironically. It's a pretty contrived piece of garbage, if you ask me, but many Christian apologists were very happy to share this thing. It's so funny, haha. Now for the last ex-religious identity on the list, the ex-Mormon. This character is based on Lexi, or as she's more popularly known, Exmo Lex.
I can't stand to have this happen again. I can't stand to commit myself in my entire life and the lives of the kids I'm raising to something that could possibly be fake. I have to make sure that I'm right this time.
I think I'll start here where many people's journey out of Mormonism begins, with the CES letter. I'll just read the little synopsis from the website. CES letter is one Latter-day Saint's honest quest to get official answers from the LDS Church on its troubling origins, history, and practices. Jeremy Runnels was offered an opportunity to discuss his own doubts with the director of the Church Educational System, CES, and was assured that his doubts could be resolved. After reading Jeremy's letter, the director promised him a response. No response ever came. Of course, nowhere close to all, or really even most, people who leave Mormonism did so because of the CES letter, but it is popularly known within Mormon and ex-Mormon culture to have been the impetus for many people questioning and eventually leaving the faith. I think because Mormons often receive from their churches, their institutions, of course, a lot of religious education, their deconstruction process can be very, very meticulous. They'll find a little detail here and compare it to what this apologist said, and they'll read a book and glean this little historical fact, and they'll compare it to the church's official history, and all of these things can come together to just be a death by 1,000 cuts for the Mormon faith.
But for the people I've talked to, they don't want to just accept anybody's word for it. So they're also, going back to like the church website itself and seeing what the church has actually said. And they're going to places like Fair Mormon, that is like a basically Mormon apologist site. And, once you end up back there, it's where you're like, is there anything you have to give me? Do you have any answers? Because I'm finding answers on the other side. And then the answers you get make you feel worse because they absolutely suck. And that is heartbreaking in a lot of ways. And I feel like that's not uncommon. There are a lot of other ex-Mormon atheists that have that same exact thing happen, where they go looking for answers anywhere they can. And the ones they find from the apologetic side make them feel worse about all of it. And it doesn't answer anything. It just hurts.
That process often ends in them profoundly losing trust in the system that educated them once they see that some simple questions just cannot be answered, even by the most elite of Mormon educators.
I was like, I am not stopping at just Mormonism.
Interesting. So it's like the CES letter didn't just contribute to being out of Mormonism, but also to questioning religious ideas in general.
It definitely did. And I mean, not even just because it brought up stuff like that, but also because it was like, the fool me once, fool me twice kind of a thing, where I'm like, I can't stand to have this happen again. I can't stand to commit myself in my entire life and the lives of the kids I'm raising to something that could possibly be fake. I have to make sure that I'm right this time.
A lot of ex-Mormons grew up in a very strong family-centered culture in very large, very interconnected families. That can be a serious difficulty to navigate once they leave the faith and kind of lose their connection to their families in this profound way.
I don't know if you saw anything about this, but my husband and I were disowned by his parents last year. And one of the things that was going on was them calling me Jezebel in the most derogatory way that they could. But, using it as like a joke in between all of the Mormon family members that I was Jezebel. And I'm like, you're using like Bible stuff as an insult. And then going to the temple and acting like you're like the nicest person ever. And that's so nasty. Like, that's so backbiting. It's so awful, especially because they were so nice to my face. And I wish that was a really isolated case, but I honestly don't think it is, just from my time being inside the church and then outside of it and seeing how people act about it.
Many spent the ages of 19 to 21, I believe it is, out on the mission field on their church-assigned mission. It's just kind of a rite of passage, especially for Mormon men, but I believe that Mormon women also go on these things. Just like with ex-evangelicals, purity culture is usually a big part of their upbringing, but one difference is that Mormons tend to marry even younger than evangelicals, and so many ex-Mormons are married before they really even get the chance to question their faith or think about it on their own. Deconstructing when you're already married, very difficult thing to do. I was lucky that my marriage worked out, but it's not the case for a lot of people who deconstruct, unfortunately. Often making things even more difficult, many ex-Mormons have kids by the time they start questioning their faith, because you get married and have kids trying to have a large family from a very young age.
I had all my kids before I left, and I have 4, and they're all really close in age. There's 15 months in between each child. And we left the church when my youngest was like 6 months old. And coming out of religion and learning all of this stuff about science and the earth and like just big, giant, huge concepts that I had never really given much thought to. And then being like, okay, so I have 4 kids to raise within, within this context that, my previous worldview was totally shattered because I'm like, God has selected these choice spirits for me to bring to earth to raise and then like help them bring them to the celestial kingdom back with God, down to like, I just had a lot of kids, and, going from like, this is what I've been commanded to do and, commanded to be a mother and to spend my whole life basically just being a wife and a mother, to now like, I have my own choices, but I've already had kids. That's not a choice that I get to make without the worldview that I had. And deconstructing Mormonism and religion while having a family and already having made that choice, that's a very permanent choice, was kind of difficult because it forced me to confront this idea of like, would I have even chosen to be a mom had I known all the information that I know now? And sometimes I think about it and I'm like, I don't know if I would have. I don't know if I would have made that choice because being a parent is really, really, really hard. I can't regret my kids because they're the best thing that's ever happened to me. But if I had never had them and I didn't know who they were as people, I don't know if I would have chosen to even have kids in the first place. It sometimes makes me uncomfortable to talk about that because I worry that people will misconstrue it and think that I regret having kids. But I also think it's important to talk about because I think that there's a lot of other ex-Mormons who were so focused on family growing up and, you have to get married early and you have to have kids early. And then all of a sudden everything changes when you realize that all of that was made up.
Deconstructing ideas about race is pretty common among ex-Mormons because the Mormon Church just has a lot of racism in its history, and up until not very long ago, surprisingly recently, the Mormon Church did not allow black people to hold the priesthood, and that was just totally okay, and we just don't talk about that anymore. The ex-Mormon post-deconstruction exploratory phase is kind of particularly interesting, one because it often occurs when people are already married and have children, so that affects things. You can't go out and get as wild when you have those responsibilities, right? But also, Mormons don't partake in any substances at all, so something it's very cute that ex-Mormons will do to, walk on the wild side, explore beyond their previous boundaries, is drink a cup of tea for the first time or have a soda with caffeine in it. Now, some Mormons, will do caffeine, but a lot don't. Basically, none do alcohol, I understand, or like weed. So trying those things at all is often a very big deal for ex-Mormons. I can understand that. It was a very big deal for me as an ex-fundamentalist. Mormons like to stereotype ex-Mormons as being anti-Mormon. If you have any criticisms at all, or even if you just speak about your apostasy in any way, you're an anti-Mormon and you're basically a hateful anti-Mormon bigot, which is absurd. They'll also say things like ex-Mormons are angry and that they never stop talking about the church even after they've left it.
A stereotype is that like, if you leave the church, you can't leave it alone. And I would say a lot of people that leave the church talk about it, but there are a ton that don't. There are so many that don't. And that's just, it just makes sense to me that you would talk about something like that. If you're like systematically abused and financially exploited and you were lied to your entire life, obviously you're going to have something to say about it at some point. But, the leaders turn that around and make the members think that people who leave the church, they know it's true and they just can't shut up about it, basically. And they say that kind of stuff a lot. So it really comes down to them othering people who leave and separating the good from the bad, the wheat from the tares, as they like to call it, and the people who are going to go to the highest level of heaven versus the people that either are going to go to outer darkness or they're going to be on the lowest tier of heaven.
A stereotype about Mormons is that they're very kind and friendly, but as ex-Mormons find out this is only a public-facing thing, Mormons are often very steeped in us versus them thinking, which can seriously negatively affect their interactions with apostates. All right, now let's discuss a few identities which are not explicitly tied to apostasy. Before we go through them, I'd like to remind you of that concept of forming an identity through the negation of another more common one. Although the following identities explicitly define themselves by what they are, I ask you to consider whether these identities are still significantly characterized by what they are not. The atheo-pagan, or atheistic pagan. This character is based on my new friend, Eliza.
If you need a story to help you relate to the world or to help remember, certain things, go for it. If you don't. Whatever helps you at the end of the day. And as long as you don't try to force that on others, it's cool.
Atheistic pagans see their gods as allegories or archetypes from which they can learn. They may not believe in their literal existence, but they do, in their own way, ritually commune with them and feel that this is a beneficial or learning experience in their lives.
I liked the idea and stories of the gods, but I liked the self-ownership that you got with atheism. And so I would read these stories, and they, for me, became really good allegories for how to live your life. I could see how the gods meant to do well and how the gods messed up. And I could use that as kind of a guide in my own life for how I wanted to be as a person. Where a pagan would look at a statue of, say, Freya, which she is on my altar, and they would think, about maybe they might, when I was pagan, at least, you may think about like what she wants or what things she's going to give to you for doing right. Whereas now, being a more atheist, I see the statue of Freya on my altar, and I think of the things that her persona rules over, like family and love, and the ability to fight back, things like that. And so I see these statues more as a reminder of the type of person I want to be.
They are usually ex-Christians who went without religion for a little while but continued searching around because they craved some kind of spiritual connection or ritual in their lives and eventually found that atheistic paganism was an option. As you can imagine, Christian ways of believing and practicing can still be influential on atheistic pagans, both because of their upbringing and because, well, they're just surrounded by Christians in their culture.
I don't lean on Christian stories for that reason, because they have such a bad taste in my mouth. So I went to pagan stories because they remind me the same way that you said, but without that really negative tone that comes to the back of my mind. Even in the pagan community, you run into that a lot. One time I went to a coven meeting of some Wiccans, and I became extremely uncomfortable when they started singing songs that, I kid you not, were Christian hymns with the word God traded out for goddess. So I'm just like, where's the exit?
They may have a difference from some other atheists in that they understand the need or desire to have a spiritual practice in one's life, even if they don't believe. Atheistic pagans, maybe I'm stereotyping here, but I think are often more tolerant of religious practice and religious people than atheists typically are.
If you need a story to help you, relate to the world or to help remember, certain things, go for it. If you don't. Whatever helps you at the end of the day, be who you need to be. And as long as you don't try to force that on others, it's cool.
Sometimes theistic pagans have some hard feelings toward atheistic pagans because they feel like you shouldn't commune with these gods if you don't believe in them. It's a bit disrespectful that you think that your spiritual practice is kind of similar to mine, even though you don't literally believe in these gods in some way. To that, I would say pagans maybe consider the fact that atheistic pagans see you guys positively enough that they want to be a part of what you're doing, even though they can't bring themselves to literally believe in your gods. They value your practice. They probably value your company too. They value your identity. They want to be a part of that. They just don't literally believe it. I don't think it's an act of disrespect, but at the same time, I can understand your perspective. Maybe I'd feel that way if I were in your shoes. I'm not sure about stereotypes about this group because typically pagans, atheistic or not, are pretty quiet about their faith, so there's not a lot of public awareness about them, not enough to generate stereotypes at least. Of course, they're quiet because it's kind of dangerous to admit that you are a pagan in the US. Christians will see you as communing with demons much of the time, and it's not comfortable to be out loud and proud about your paganism, so they keep pretty quiet. This experience is kind of something they share with atheists, which is why I think that atheists and pagans are actually natural allies, but you guys aren't ready for that video. Next up, the Sentientist, or Ethical Vegan. This character is based on my fellow Austin, Texas local and vegan activist, Brian. There were some technical issues with Brian's interview on my end, so I don't have a lot of clips to show. I'm sorry about that, Brian, but I hope I can represent your perspective okay here, because I'm a vegan too. A sentientist is someone who sees non-human animals as sentient creatures worthy of moral consideration, as humans are. As a result, they do not usually consume animal products and strongly oppose animal exploitation in the forms of animal agriculture. They may also call themselves ethical vegans or just vegans instead of sentientists. Bit of a mouthful. Not all atheists are sentientists, but I think all sentientists are atheists. At least I've never come across someone who would identify themselves as a sentientist who is not already an atheist. Not using animal products may not seem like something that's significant enough to bond over to form a community or identity around, but as I've said, when it's so common to do a certain thing, when you're expected to do a certain thing, and you and just a few other people you know don't do that certain thing, that can bond you together. There are sentientist or vegan communities all over the US that get together to help each other source plant-based products, to share recipes, to cook together, to even garden together sometimes, and at other times even protest animal agriculture. I'm not very involved in any of these communities, but I did get the chance to meet Brian when I was at a vegan food truck park here in Austin, and following his activism has been pretty inspiring. He's made some serious progress actually, and even at one point was arrested for ridiculous reasons and was bailed out by his community really quickly. Very admirable, I think. That's just the name of the game when you're fighting the machine, man, the meat machine. Vegans, especially outspoken ones, can encounter a lot of frustration and even resentment in atheist communities. When I made a video about why I went vegan, I was not trying to tell anyone what they had to do, but I was accused endlessly of being preachy and condescending. Now, there are plenty of vegans who are very passionate about what they do and can come off as preachy and condescending, so I guess that just carried over into people's perception of me. But sometimes that idea, that reputation is very much unearned. As you can imagine, this can be a significant barrier for vegans in atheist communities. Sometimes in atheist communities, someone will just mention that they're vegan, and the people in the atheist community just keep bringing it up and talking about it, mentioning it and questioning the person about it. And then when they just answer the questions, people get upset and are like, stop preaching at me. I've seen this happen many times. It's really frustrating on all sides, I think. So yeah, stereotypes about sentientists or vegans is that they're preachy and condescending, or that they're physically weak. I think all of those stereotypes can be put to rest upon one meeting with Brian. Dude's a little swole and also very kind and soft-spoken. Vegans see speaking against animal exploitation and destruction of our environment as a matter of life and death, not just for animals, but for humans. So I think it's understandable that they'd be passionate, if a bit condescending, about it. Moving on to the last but not least on the list, the atheistic Satanist. This character is based on the incredibly articulate Dex Desjardins.
When you're a Satanist, you've identified yourself intentionally as an outsider. You've put yourself at odds with the mainstream society and have decided that rather than, kind of lurk in the shadows as a misfit, you're going to be sort of loud and proud about the fact that you are one.
I could tell you what an atheistic Satanist is, but I could never do it as well as Dex, the Satanist that I interviewed for this.
So Satanism, for the Satanic Temple and its members, is a non-theistic religion that is focused on the central symbol or metaphor of Satan as depicted in Romantic era literature as a symbol of rebellion against arbitrary authority, the pursuit of knowledge, and personal liberation. So we don't believe in a literal deity of Satan or a spiritual Satan, the way that most people think Satanists believe in one, but rather it's just sort of the metaphor around which our ethos coalesces. And this is true both for the Satanic Temple as well as for the Church of Satan, and really almost all of the major satanic organizations out there. When you're a Satanist, you've identified yourself intentionally as an outsider. You've put yourself at odds with the mainstream society, usually not because you necessarily wanted to be the outsider, but because over the course of your life, you found yourself so to be, and have decided that rather than, kind of lurk in the shadows as a misfit, you're going to be sort of loud and proud about the fact that you are one.
Just to stress this for people who didn't hear it the first time, Satanists usually do not believe that Satan is real. They're not devil worshippers. Satan is just a metaphor that they commune around. If you've heard of Satanism, or specifically the Satanic Temple before, you might think that they're a primarily political group that engages in protests. That's not actually correct, though, and Dex was able to correct that misconception of mine in our interview. That idea is actually, was furthered by a 2019 documentary called Hail Satan. Great documentary, didn't quite get the message across accurately. The Satanic Temple, like other religious organizations, primarily provides community space for the members who are like-minded so they can enrich each other's lives. The Satanic Temple does not typically hold protests, although members can be quite politically engaged and engage in protests on their own and identify themselves as Satanists in doing so.
I heard about the Satanic Temple the way a lot of people did through some of the early media stunts that have been associated with them. And I say media stunts associated with them because the fact of the matter is that the most famous things that Satanic Temple is known for, like the bondage babies protests or the one with milk and stuff like that, those weren't the Satanic Temple. Those were a member named Jex Blackmore and her immediate friends who were doing these things pretty much unilaterally. And then they got, but she was a leader within the Satanic Temple at the time. And so those kind of got stuck to us, and people think that that's what we do. And the fact is we almost never do protests. I've been to one in my 8 years with the Satanic Temple.
There are actually two major satanic organizations in the US, the Church of Satan and the Satanic Temple. The Church of Satan was founded in 1966 by Anton LaVey. As their website says, "We are the first above-ground organization in history openly dedicated to the acceptance of man's true nature, that of a carnal beast, living in a cosmos that is indifferent to our existence. To us, Satan is the symbol that best suits the nature of we who are carnal by birth, people who feel no battles raging between our thoughts and feelings, we who do not embrace the concept of a soul imprisoned in a body." Very theatrical. Anton LaVey held some views that many, including myself, find quite objectionable. He might have been described as a social Darwinist. So while many in the Church of Satan may not actually espouse those ideas themselves, understandably, plenty of people feel uncomfortable joining an organization that has that in its roots.
Satanic Temple members tend to lean pretty far left. I would say most would be Democrat through anarchist. And then in the Church of Satan, it tends to be more center left through far right. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that, Anton LaVey was himself, very much into this whole might is right philosophy, this whole idea of social Darwinism, which of course has been completely debunked as a social science of any value. So we have both things that unite and divide us, and yet we all manage to fit underneath this umbrella term of Satanism.
Some might feel more comfortable joining the more recently founded Satanic Temple instead. Here's a clip of Dex discussing joining the Satanic Temple as opposed to the Church of Satan, which she did at one time have some interest in.
And it was after that I started to really look into what they believed and came to realize, oh, wow, here's this, fundamentally the same basic concept of an ethos built around this symbol of rebellion, but without the stupid Ayn Randian stuff. So I was like, all right, this is something I might be able to get on board with. So I signed up.
Since I interviewed someone from the Satanic Temple, I'm just going to speak about the Satanic Temple perspective on Satanism here. Satanism is very concerned with individualism and non-dogmatic ways of thinking, meaning that even its core tenets are subject to violation or change at any time. I'd say that this is a pretty significant difference between Satanism and other religions.
Within the Satanic Temple, we have our core 7 tenets, which are non-dogmatic statements that we are meant to interpret on a person-by-person basis and then apply to our lives holistically. So they're literally not carved in stone, literally or metaphorically. They are subject to change and revision. They are not meant to be used as a cudgel with which you beat your fellow Satanist if you think they've done wrong. They're meant to inspire one to act with nobility and sense and compassion.
When I asked Dex what separates Satanists from other kinds of atheists, I was very excited that he brought up one of the main ideas I wanted to play with in this video.
Atheism just defines what you are not. You are not a believer in a deity. Satanism describes what you are. So it's the positive values element that's missing from the term atheism. You can be an atheist and it doesn't really say much about what your values or ethics are. But when you say Satanist, you can narrow it down to a fairly predictable category of values and beliefs.
As for stereotypes about Satanists, I'll once again just let Dex explain.
The most common stereotype of Satanists in general, I think, of course, is that we literally worship the devil, eat babies, hate Christians, and all those things. We're the witches that bring the blight of the devil upon the earth and all of that nonsense. Or we run the world government. And then on the other hand, specifically with the Satanic Temple, because we have been more visible and more active, politically speaking, you get people who claim that we're just, shock value activists, and that we don't actually have any beliefs other than trolling. I personally don't enjoy trolling. I find it to be very anxiety-inducing, and I certainly don't eat babies or worship a literal devil.
Okay, we are finally through all 8 on this list. I'll give you a few more of my thoughts and then wrap up. While most identities on this list were explicitly defined by the negation of a past identity, those identities are still implicitly defined by characteristics they do possess. In other words, what they are. Ex-Muslims share life experiences that are unique to them and are bonded together with others who share those experiences, other ex-Muslims. In this way, ex-Muslim becomes an identity of its own. The same goes for the rest of the X's. Leaving our faith provided us enough shared experience to serve as the basis for identity. Given that we're atheists in a place where religion is culturally dominant, we also share ongoing experiences, which further differentiate us from the religious majority. Now, to address the last 3 identities on this list, which attempt to explicitly define themselves by what they are. I think one could argue that these are just as defined by what they are not as any of the X identities. Atheistic pagans are not theists, not Christians, and in the typical sense at least, not pagans. Sentientists or ethical vegans are not theists, not consumers of animal products, and not in agreement with the vast majority who condone animal exploitation. Atheistic Satanists are not theists, not Christians, not devil worshippers, and not beholden to the status quo in matters of religion or politics. In making this point, I'm not saying that these identities are kidding themselves and explicitly defining themselves by what they are. What I am saying is that identity is always constructed from ideas about what one is and what one is not. One identity is not somehow more real or valid than another just because it defines itself in a particular way. But what do you think? Was this a helpful video or a not unhelpful video? Who did I leave out? What did I miss? Please do let me know in the comments. I am really looking forward to reading the comments on this one because I find this subject so interesting, and I'm sure there's still plenty for me to learn from you guys. With that, thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. Special thanks to my patrons for their constant love and support. If you want to hear more from me, then subscribe. As always, if you are an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to others in the comments, and until next time, stay skeptical.